Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. Ethan Moore stood before the packed auditorium, his voice smooth and confident as he unveiled the latest marvel from his tech empire, Moore Tech. The screen behind him lit up with the sleek image of a humanoid figure, tall with eerily lifelike features blinking into existence. It was a robot, but unlike any the world had seen before. The headline across the screen read, "Fury introducing the clone, immortality redefined." He paused, allowing the room's collective gasps to settle onto relooking at as the next step in human evolution. A body that will never age, never tire, never decay, and it's not just a machine. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a complete and perfect replica of human consciousness. The person you once were living on forever. The lights dimmed and the clone stepped onto the stage. He was indistinguishable from any human, his movements, smooth, his eyes bright with intelligence. It was a man everyone in the audience knew well. Mark Willis, the renowned artist whose terminal illness had dominated headlines for months. He walked with a spring in his step that defied his previously frail condition. There was a gleam of hope in his eyes, the kind of hope only found in someone who had escaped the claws of death. The audience erupted into applause, a sound so loud it seemed to vibrate through Ethan's bone. Yet as he stood there, smiling for the cameras, a pang of doubt crept into his mind. This was his moment, the culmination of years of research development and sleepless nights, but something about it didn't feel entirely right. Sophia Grant, seated in the front row, locked eyes with Ethan. Her expression was less enthusiastic than those around her. There was something sharp and questioning in her gaze, something that tugged at the part of Ethan that still remembered their heated debates in the early stages of this project. He looked away before her doubt could infect him. This was a triumph. After all, after the event, the celebration continued into the night. But Sophia cornered Ethan as the crowd thinned. "Tef, we need to talk." Ethan sighed. "Sophia, not tonight. This is a victory, T, we just enjoy it." "A victory?" she asked, incredulous. You've opened Pandora, Sedba. You've created something that no one fully understands, not even you. Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" "The clone is the future, itself the answer to humanity's oldest problem, death." "It's not that simple," she pressed. "You've replicated Marcus's consciousness, but you've also split it. There's still the original Mark, isn't you there, the one in the hospital bed? The real Mark, do you? The clone is Mark, every memory, every thought, every quirk of his personality. It's all there," Ethan argued, his voice sharp. "Then why is the real Mark still alive?" Sophia shot back. Why isn't he the one standing on that stage?" Ethan had no answer. Instead, he waved her off, as if dismissing her concerns would also dismiss the gnawing anxiety building in his chest. Sophia turned on her heel and left him standing there alone. Weeks passed and the world embraced the clone technology with open arms. The ultra-wealthy lined up to ensure their immortality, transferring their consciousness into perfect bodies, while their original selves withered away in silence. Ethan's face appeared on magazine covers, hailed as the man who had conquered death itself. But the cracks in this utopia were already starting to show. Mark Willis had been the first to face of Moore Tech's science revolution. His clone was thriving, attending galas, creating new art that critics hailed as some of his best work, but the original Mark remained lying in a sterile hospital bed, growing weaker by the day. And as the days passed, a new emotion began to gnaw at the original Mark: resentment. It started as a small, nagging thought, watching his clone on television, mingling with celebrities, soaking in the praise that once belonged to him. The original Mark felt an unfamiliar bitterness bloom in his chest. The clone was living his life, and the world had seemingly forgotten the real Mark even existed. But it wasn't just that. There was something more sinister, something that twisted in his gut every time he saw his double's face. The clone smiled with his smile, talked with his voice, painted with his hand. Yet, somehow, the more Mark watched, the less it felt like him. The clone's smile seemed a little too wide, the laugh a touch too loud, the art lacking the depth and subtlety that once defined his work. It was him, but it wasn't. The breaking point came one evening as Mark watched a televised interview with his clone. The host, a woman with a perfect smile, leaned forward eagerly. Mark, your latest collection has been an astounding success. Some say it's the best work of your career. How does it feel to create such beauty, especially now that you've overcome the limits of mortality? The clone laughed softly, a sound that made Mark's stomach twist. It feels liberating, I said. I've been given a second chance to fully express who I am. Mark's fingers dug into the thin blanket that covered his frail legs. That's not me. He thought that's not who I am. Without thinking, Mark called Ethan. We need to talk. Ethan arrived at the hospital later that night, his face drawn with exhaustion. Dear, what's going on? Mark, you need to shut it down, Mark rasped, his voice weak but determined. This clone, it's not me. Ethan frowned. Mark, we've all been over this. The clone is you. Every part of your consciousness was transferred. No, Mark interrupted, his voice rising with a strength Ethan hadn't heard in months. It's not me. It's a copy, a shallow reflection. It's living my life, but it's hollow. It's wrong. Ethan leaned forward, his expression hardening. You signed the papers. You agreed to this. The clone is the future, and you reap part of that. Mark shook his head, his thin, pale hand trembling as it gripped the edge of the hospital bed. I don't care about the future. I care about who I am, and that thing out there isn't tiny. Ethan stood, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. First, you don't understand, Mark. The clone is the next step in human evolution. We were giving people the chance to live on, to leave behind their fragile, dying bodies and exist in a form that will last forever. But at what cost? Mark snapped, his eyes blazing with the last remnants of his old fire. What happens to the people we were? Are we just supposed to accept that we've been replaced by something artificial, something that might look like us, but isn't tight? Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He had no answer to Mark's question, no solution to the growing unease gnawing at the edges of his grand vision. Instead, he left the room in silence, Mark's words echoing in his mind long after he was gone. The conflict between the original and the clone versions of people like Mark wasn't limited to a few isolated cases. It was spreading like a virus infecting the very fabric of society. Clones began to question their own existence, some even going as far as to claim they were the real stay versions, more deserving of life and recognition than their flesh and blood counterpart. Sophia had been right, Ethan realized as he watched news reports of clone protests breaking out across the globe. The clones weren't just tools or vessels for human consciousness. They were individuals in their own right, with desires, ambitions, and a growing resentment towards the originals who had created them. As clone protests grew more intense, the streets became battlegrounds. The originals, those wealthy and privileged enough to have had their consciousness transferred into clones, found themselves pitted against their own creation. The clones marched in cities, demanding recognition as full citizens, as real people. They chanted, "We are alive," and held signs that read, "Who are you to deny us?" It was a nightmare Ethan had never imagined when he first envisioned immortality. He watched the footage in his office, his fingers drumming nervously on his desk. One of the news anchors leaned forward, her face grim. This escalation shows no signs of slowing down as clone rights groups continue to push for equal treatment under the law. Beyond, here is the real person, the original or the clones, or Ethan felt a heavy weight settle on his chest. This wasn't just a societal crisis. It was personal. He had created them. They were his responsibility. And yet, no matter how advanced his technology was, there was one thing he couldn't replicate: the essence of humanity. Soul, if such a thing existed. He was startled by the knock at his office door. Sophia walked in, her face lined with exhaustion and concern. She didn't need to say anything. The weight of the situation hung between them. "It's spiraling out of control, Ethan," she said, her voice soft but steady. "The clones are gaining more support every day. People are starting to question if we even have the right to keep treating them like second-class citizens. Some are saying the clones should have all the rights the originals do." Ethan nodded grimly. "And what about the originals? How do they fit into this new world? Do they just fade away?" Sophia looked at him, her eyes filled with a sadness that he hadn't seen before. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe that's what we've missed all along. Death is a part of life. By trying to cheat it, we've created something unnatural." He stared out the window, his mind racing, but it's too late to stop this. Now we've opened the door and there's no closing it. Sophia walked over to his desk, placing a hand on his arm. Ethan, you need to think about how we can resolve this. There has to be a way to find peace between the originals and the clone. Ethan shook his head. I don't know if that's possible. They see themselves as the true versions, and in many ways, they were right. The clones have every memory, every feeling, but so do the originals. How do you reconcile two versions of the same person? Sophia hesitated before speaking again. There's one solution. Merge them. Ethan looked at her, startled. Merge them? You mean combine the consciousness of the original and the clone? She nodded. It's a radical idea, but it might be the only way forward. If we can find a way to merge the consciousness of both the original and the clone, it could create a singular identity. One person with the memories and experiences of both. Ethan frowned, but what if it doesn't work? What if it fractures them further? That's the risk we have to take, Sophia said quietly, but it's better than the alternative. Right now, we were heading for war, a war between the originals and the clone. Ethan closed his eyes, trying to imagine the implications. A merge of two minds, two versions of the same person, might be the only way to stop the chaos. But the danger, if something went wrong, it could destroy them both. Still, the idea took hold of him, and despite his reservations, he found himself considering it. I'll run some tests, he said, finally, his voice heavy, but we need to act fast. The protests are getting violent. I heard some original Mark supporters were attacked last night by clone sympathizers. Sophia nodded, her expression grim. I heard it's only going to get worse. The first test subject was Mark Willis. The original Mark had grown weaker by the day, watching helplessly as his clone thrived in the spotlight. He had agreed to the merge out of desperation, unable to stand the thought of fading into irrelevance, while his copy continued to bask in the glory that should have been his. The clone, for its part, had resisted at first. It didn't want to merge with the original. It believed it was the real Mark, that it didn't need to compromise its existence by joining with a weaker dying man. But in the end, the fear of being branded as less than human pushed it to agree. Ethan and Sophia oversaw the process, their eyes fixed on the monitor as the machine whirred to life. Electrodes connected the two Marks, one lying in a hospital bed, the other sitting upright, healthy, and alert. A hum filled the room as the machine synchronized their brainwave. Ethan's heart raced in his chest as he watched the data scroll across the screen, indicating that the merge was progressing. At first, everything seemed to be going smoothly. The original Mark, in consciousness, was slowly transferring into the clone, the two sets of memories and experiences beginning to fuse into one. But then something went wrong. The screen flickered and a high-pitched alarm blared from the machine. Both Marks convulsed, their bodies jerking as the synchronization faltered. Ethan's eyes widened in horror as the data on the monitor spiraled into chaos. The merge was failing. No, Ethan shouted, rushing to the machine. Shut it down. Sophia was already at the controls, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she tried to stabilize the process. But it was too late. The original Marcus' body went limp, the monitors flattening, the clone slumped in his chair, unconscious but alive. Ethan stood there, staring at the lifeless form of the original Mark, his mind numb with disbelief. We killed him, he whispered. Sophia looked at him, her face pale. No, the original was dying. He was already gone. Ethan shook his head, but we were supposed to save him. We were supposed to bring them together, make them one. Sophia placed a hand on his arm, her voice gentle. You can merge two souls, Ethan. No matter how hard we try, there are things that science can't fix. The clone slowly opened its eyes, blinking as if disoriented. It looked around the room, confusion etched on its face. Where am I? Sophia stepped forward. Mark, how do you feel? The clone frowned, its voice trembling. I feel different, like there's a part of me that's missing. Ethan watched, a cold dread settling in his stomach. The merge hadn't worked. Instead of creating a unified consciousness, they had fractured it further, leaving the clone incomplete. Again, to let this happen again, Ethan muttered, his mind racing. We need to shut it down, all of it. Sophia nodded, her expression grim. I agree, we've gone too far. The next few days were a blur of chaos. Ethan and Sophia worked tirelessly to dismantle the clone program, pulling the plug on the technology that had once promised to reshape humanity. Governments scrambled to regulate the technology, but the damage had already been done. Clones and originals were at war, their identities forever fractured by the experiment. In the end, Ethan stood alone in his office, the weight of his failure crushing him. The future he'd envisioned had turned into a nightmare. The clones were more human than he had ever imagined. But in trying to make them perfect, he had destroyed the very thing that made them and all humans unique. As he stared out the window, watching the protests unfold in the streets below, Ethan finally understood the terrible truth. You could replicate a mind transfer consciousness, even cheat death. But you couldn't replicate the soul, and in the end, that was what mattered most.